Danielle Smith, guest hosting for Common Sense Calgary. We're doing a series of interviews with candidates for Calgary City Council for the municipal election this fall. And our next candidate is for Ward 3. His name is Nate Pike, and he joins us now. Nate, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So Ward 3 is currently occupied by Council Member Jyoti Gondek, who's made the decision to run for mayor. I have to ask you, when did you make your decision to jump in? Was it before or after she announced that she was going to be leaving the job?
It was before she announced. It was a bit of a complicated situation that sort of led me into running again. The biggest factor for me was that there were several people in my community who I respect, who are huge community leaders, and they asked if I would consider running if the spot opened up, and I said that I would. And then I heard through the grapevine that the spot was going to be opening up. And so here we are.
So tell me what it is that you think that your experience brings to the position. Tell me, I know you're a paramedic, but tell us how you think that will help you as a city council member.
There's a bunch of different components for me. So the first part, for sure, the paramedic piece plays a big part of it, because a big part of being, I think, a good paramedic is being able to talk to people, being able to build relationships, being able to build trust. And that's fundamentally, to me, one of the biggest things that I think is lacking in municipal politics, particularly in Calgary right now. There's a huge trust deficit, for lack of a better term. And I think that needs to be corrected. And I think that requires somebody who's willing to be sincere, somebody who's willing to be honest. That's certainly what I've learned from communicating with people in my line of work as a paramedic. But I'm also not a neophyte to politics by any stretch of the imagination. My family has been political for a very, very long time. My grandfather was one of the founding members of the Reform Party. My dad helped write policy for them. I've been active in provincial politics, unsuccessfully, but I've been active in provincial politics for a while now, and I keep my finger fairly close on the pulse of sort of what's going on. And the biggest, again, for me, the biggest thing just boils down to the fact that I don't see. There's a whole lot of theater that goes on, and there's a whole lot of insincerity that goes on, and that, quite frankly, scares me, because I think we're seeing again, I'll use the term trust deficit. I think we're seeing the results of that play out on hyperdrive in regards to the different reactions that we're seeing with the COVID situation that we're currently going through, as well as others. But I think that we really have to, anybody entering public office has to be aware of that, and they have to be willing to step up and build the trust. And in my line of work, with the paramedic stuff, I can't do anything without my patient being willing to trust me. So
that's a great connection. Let's talk about the outgoing councillor, Jyoti Gondek. Give me an idea of how you think she's done over the last 4 years. Are there any decisions that she made that you would have done differently?
I think, gosh, I don't envy anyone who's been on the current council. I mean, fundamentally, when we're talking about city council, I think it's slightly different than a lot of elected roles, because it operates very much like a board of directors. And I've had the privilege of sitting on a couple of boards, and all it takes is a couple of, I'll use the term, problematic people, and the whole thing can get derailed quite easily. And especially when you factor in the fact that this particular board of directors exists in the public spotlight. So we do get all of the theatrics that I referred to. I think it's very, very difficult for anyone to be able to operate truly independently. That being said, I think that Jyoti has done some impressive things for our community. I think she's been an incredible advocate for transit. I hope to maintain that. And there's certainly things that I would do differently. I'm a different person. So yeah.
Okay, well, you put a lot on the table. So let's begin with transit, because I know that Ms. Gondek was attempting to find a way to get at least some transit option for North Calgary, even though the Green Line is not going to be built as it was initially intended. So tell me what you think ought to be done there. I mean, there was a lot of consensus before when it was a $4.5 billion project heading all the way to the north, all the way to the south, three parties, three levels of government funding it. Now it's only a fraction, only half of what it was supposed to be. It costs more. And you've got even the transportation minister saying, I don't support this project because it doesn't connect to anything. So what is your solution for North Calgary?
I've lived in Calgary for longer than I'd like to admit, because it'll date me. But I remember when the C train first started up, and there were very similar arguments back then. There was the argument that, well, it's not going to service that many people. It's a small corridor. I think when we're talking about these sorts of infrastructure projects, particularly transportation infrastructure projects, we have to look at them as incremental steps towards a greater goal. And for me, what transit represents is a bunch of different things. It's not just it would be nice to have a train here. The lack of reliable, accessible, affordable transit is something that disproportionately affects people who are in lower to middle incomes. It has a huge impact on the opportunity that those people are able to access. And that's, to me, looking at Calgary as a city that is desperately needing to recover from a lot of different things. The more that we can make those pathways accessible to people who are going to help drive that recovery, the better it's going to be. I think it's clear. I mean, my goal for North Central Calgary, obviously the Green Line, even if it went ahead with its current framework, it wouldn't be able to service North Central Calgary in any real capacity. So the conversation has to shift. I think that there's been some great initiatives that have happened with the transit on demand. And I think that there's, the 17th Avenue Max line, the BRT there, it gets used, and it gets used very effectively. And I think that something like that provides not only scalability, but it also provides a more immediate solution. I mean, the reality is, when we're talking about transit in the North Central Corridor, the land acquisition hasn't even been done. I asked a couple people 6 months ago if somebody showed up with $5 billion right now and said, there you go, build the thing, would we be able to do it? And the answer is no, because we haven't done the land acquisition part. So there's a big piece that needs to happen in order to make transit accessible soon. And that's my biggest priority. What that looks like, I'm not a transit specialist. I don't believe that it's the role of elected officials to be specialists in all of the things, but I do believe that it is the role of elected officials to be willing to listen to the experts. I mean, there's people who have spent their entire professional lives studying how to move people around in cities. And for me to come in with my experience in moving one person at a time as a paramedic and say, well, I've got the answers. That's a kind of hubris that I don't want to bring to the table.
But you do think that BRT, that almost goes back to the original kind of plan that they were initially talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that I like about the BRT is we are going through, in so many different ways, a paradigm shift in Calgary. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that I like about a BRT is that, vehicles have a certain lifespan. And as we continue along with this paradigm shift that we're going through, I think that having the ability to adjust the types of vehicles that we're using is really valuable. And I mean, at the end of the day, one of the biggest concerns that I hear from the residents of Ward 3 is transit. So I don't think it's okay for me to step up to the table and say, well, there's a plan and it might work, it might not, but you should elect me anyways. That's just not good enough, and it's not what people deserve. So one of my commitments is that I want to do whatever is necessary to improve transit up here. If that looks like a BRT, cool. If that looks like a dedicated Max line, cool. Again, I'm not the transit specialist, but I think that it's the role of elected officials to sort of set the priorities and let the experts go from there.
So let me ask you then about, so you mentioned, obviously, number one priority is transit in Ward 3. Give me a couple of other top issues that you hear about.
The biggest one, I would even say bigger than transit, is stability. The median income of Ward 3 is very middle class. And the middle class is some of, I would argue, the demographic that's probably been sort of hammered the worst over the last couple of years. We have, when I'm out talking with people, I'm hearing stories about tradespeople who are looking at moving to different cities because they don't see opportunity here in Calgary anymore. We have to address that. That's one of the reasons why I'm, as much as I know that the current framework for the Green Line isn't going to address the transit issues in Ward 3, I'm disappointed that we're stuck in the lag that we're in, because that's a whole lot of jobs that we're just leaving on the table during a time period where people need them, I would argue, more than any time in the last 20 years.
Yeah. Any other Ward 3 issues you want to raise?
I think, well, the stability one is huge. Property taxes is another one, but that's a really complex nut to crack. Like I really struggle when people step up and they say, "Oh, I'm going to lower property taxes," because my immediate reaction is, "Okay, well, then what are you going to cut?" When we live in a time where people are clamoring for improved services, they're clamoring for improved access to services, and you want to decrease the revenue. Cool. How's that going to work? It doesn't. So the thing that I want to see, I think that there needs to be a bigger conversation with the province in regards to how the city collects revenue, how the budgeting process works. Because right now it's backwards from how any other household would do it. People, when I come home and I know what I'm getting paid at the end of the month, then I decide what I want to get. I get to decide how much I'm going to spend on groceries. And the city does it completely backwards now. They set a budget and then they go, well, how are we going to collect this money? And that's largely mandated by the province. So I think that there needs to be a bit of a renegotiation with the province in regards to how can we adjust that approach to make sure that Calgarians are going to prosper. Because as much as the province has its goals, in order for Alberta to prosper, the municipalities have to prosper as well.
Let me ask you, just for you to elaborate on that. So are you suggesting that the province needs to give more tax room to the city, so take less provincial education property tax, or are you talking about new taxation powers? So
no, I'm talking predominantly about revisiting how much the province takes. I mean, I think it's working from memory here, and like I said, it's been a long day, but I believe it's about 40% of the collected revenue that the province takes from the city. And under normal times, when Calgary had office buildings downtown that were full, I think that's, there's an argument to be made that was probably an equitable arrangement, but we don't have that right now. And we're looking at an infrastructure deficit. We're looking at a tax deficit that, in fairness, the previous city council tried to do a good job of addressing. But in order to move forward, not just as a city, but as a province, I think we need to have that conversation with the province.
Okay, so that's how you'd address the revenue picture. Let's talk about the spending picture. So do you think that the city's spending about the right amount, or too little, or too much?
That's a loaded question. I'll say in some places, I think that the city is spending the right amount. I'll say in some places, I think the city's spending not enough. And then I'll say in some places, I think that there's different ways that the city could be spending the money that it's spending. One of the ideas that I would like to see how people react to is public art is an example. So I'm a big believer in public art. And I'm a big believer that in order to attract investment, we have to be able to present a Calgary that's a vibrant city that people want to live in and work in. And completely ignoring the aesthetic of the city isn't going to accomplish that. So I do believe that the city has some role in providing public art. That being said, I'm not sure that the budget is appropriate when you compare it to the size of the infrastructure projects that it's tied to. So one of the things that I would like to see is perhaps we could move some of that money that goes towards the public art, still maintain a public art budget. And I think the new framework that this city has put forward is going to be interesting to see how it plays out, because I like the idea of using more local artists. But I would like to see maybe we can move some of that money to affordable housing. Because that's already a huge problem. And I have a really hard time justifying massive public art projects when we have people who don't have access to housing.
So talk to me a bit about affordable housing, because I think there's a number of ways that you can approach it. One is to deal with the homelessness issue that we have downtown. The other issue is first-time home buyers getting that first home. Often it's getting a home in the suburbs, or there's also, do we build more multifamily housing, knowing that that's also a way to get access to affordable housing? How do you identify the biggest area of problem?
I think You painted an incredibly broad picture there, so I'm going to have to address each of those on their own, because I think it would be disingenuous for me not. The biggest thing that I hear from homeless advocates, and certainly with the work that I do, I cross paths with a lot of the houseless people, is the term that I've been told is the best one to use. So I'm going to try to stick with that. It's a paradigm shift for me, but so I stumbled. But the biggest thing that houseless advocates are pushing for is we can't solve anything until we get people a safe place to stay. And what that safe place looks like is going to vary. I think that the model that the DI uses, where there's graduated access to different types of accommodations, varies depending on a person's progress. But fundamentally, until we give people safe places to stay, we're not going to be able to address the houselessness problem. So that's my biggest thing. And I take a look at some of the affordable housing facilities that I visit through work, and some of them are pretty horrifying. And it's very, very hard for somebody who's trying to extricate themselves from the problem of houselessness when they aren't afforded any dignity. I think there's a certain amount of dignity that all people should have, they're entitled to. And so that's the houseless answer.
Do you think that the problem there is that they're not spending enough money maintaining existing facilities? Do they have the wrong facilities? Do they have the right facilities in the wrong place? Do they not have the supports? Okay, so how would you address all that? That's a lot to address.
Well, I think again, it goes back to the fundamental role of an elected official is to listen to the experts. And so when I listen to the people that I talk to who are out on the streets multiple times a week, trying to get people supports, there's no one catch-all situation. I think it's or one catch-all fix. I think it's a combination of things, and it's going to depend on the individual what combination they access. So the first thing that I would want to do is make sure that I'm listening to the people who are dealing with the houseless population, because they're the ones. I come from I'm a middle-aged white guy. I come from a place of incredible privilege, and I know it. And so for me to try to identify accurately, despite the fact that I interact with the houseless population all the time, for me to try to identify and say, this is what they need, that's never worked in history. So I think that we have to have some real consultations and conversations with the people who are dealing with it.
Well, before we leave this, and I will get to the issue of affordable housing for more middle-income families, let me ask you a few questions from your perspective as a paramedic, because I've been wondering what your perspective is on the battle that the city has had over centralized dispatch, and whether that's creating any problems in response times. Can you shed some light on that? Was that the right battle to fight, or is centralized dispatch the right way to go to serve the communities that you're serving?
I have to be very careful with my answer. So you'll forgive me if I hedge a little bit on this one, simply because I do still work for one of the organizations involved in this conversation. Yeah. I haven't seen any compelling, consistent data that suggests that there have been major delays in regards to response times because of the change of dispatch. What data I have seen, and anybody can do a Google search of this, so I'm by no means using any sort of proprietary information, throw that disclaimer in there now, is a gross under-resourcing of EMS and first responder resources. You every 4 months, there's a story in the news where some news organization has FOIPed what are the response times, what are the red alert times, which are the times where there's no ambulances available, and the numbers are always horrifying. So to me, the issue that the city perhaps should have been advocating for and should continue to advocate for is addressing the disconnect that there seems to be between what the city of Calgary requires in regards to resources and what the province is providing.
So then let me broaden that out, because that was one of the things that came out that was interesting about centralized dispatch. Is one of the arguments that was being made is, well, we dispatch fire and EMS together, and there's a I think over 50% of the calls that fire goes to are medical calls. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, does that seem an appropriate use of fire sources, or is that just a stopgap measure because we're under-resourcing EMS?
I think that it depends on the call, quite frankly. I think that I know that sometimes people will see an emergency scene where there's a house and there's an ambulance and there's a couple of fire trucks and maybe there's some police there. And that, from looking at that from the outside, that can certainly look like, well, what could be going on so bad in there? Well, a lot, actually. And I can tell you that with what I do as a paramedic, part of my role for the level of practitioner that I am, which is an ALS paramedic, if you want to get fancy, is my job is to, let's say somebody suffers a cardiac arrest. My job is to, how we would say, run that code. So I'm responsible for making sure that all the moving pieces are moving in the directions that they're supposed to be. I'm the one responsible for making sure all the medications are being administered inside of someone's living room or in their bedroom. And I'm responsible for making sure that the appropriate diagnostics are happening when they're supposed to happen. So if I have to do all of that while I'm doing chest compressions, it's not going to happen. So the response that we get from fire on those major calls is absolutely critical, because they do I don't want to use this term, but it's the only one that's going to come into my head right now. They do the heavy manual labor, and there's skill to that. I'm not diminishing their role in any way, but they play a critically important part in critical calls. And so for a cardiac arrest or a near cardiac arrest, it's totally appropriate to send fire. Now, when we're talking about, for example, COVID calls, do I believe that it's appropriate to necessarily send fire as first in on scene on a COVID positive patient when they're working with a crew of 4 in a firehouse of 8 to 12 people on shift? No, I think it would be better to send an ambulance. But that brings us back to resource depletion within EMS.
Right.
And again, it's a Google search away for anyone who wants to look.
Well, let me add one more element to it then too, because when police get called out, they often get called out to mental health calls too, mental health and addiction calls. And so there has been what has been named a defund the police movement, with the idea of taking money from the police budget to dedicate to other types of responders. Do you support that movement?
Again, I'm sorry to keep dragging you into nuance, but there's a lot of nuance there that needs to be acknowledged. So first of all, the police already have a lot of different programs that utilize that sort of thing. Do they exist in the volume that I'd like to see them? No. But there's a program called PACT, which pairs a nurse with a police officer, and that's what they do. And I think that that's critical, because if you take a look at what the legal framework is for addressing somebody in crisis, especially if they're at risk, and I'm going to get technical, of hurting themselves or anyone else, there's an actual legal framework that needs to be applied. And I do not, as a paramedic, have the authority to utilize that legal framework. It requires somebody who's a peace officer or a police officer. So if we're talking about somebody who's having a mental health crisis and they are hurting themselves or hurting other people, you need to have somebody there who's able to arrest them under what's called a Form 10. If you don't have that, then you can be as convincing as you want to try to be. But if that person isn't reachable because of the depth of their mental health crisis, and that happens, I've certainly gone to patients where it's like, there's no amount of verbal judo that I can do that's going to de-escalate this situation, because that person's not there right now. And those situations absolutely require somebody who can use the legal force of the law in order to make that person safe. And that's the priority. I can comfortably say I've never been on a mental health crisis call where I have seen, and this isn't to say it doesn't happen, but I haven't seen it, where police have deliberately escalated the situation and used more physical force than necessary. I would argue that if a paramedic is there, or if a healthcare practitioner is there and they're doing their job, again, it's no different than running a code. My job is to make sure all the pieces are moving in the right direction. So I can tell you that when I go to somebody who's experiencing a mental health crisis, before anything happens, we're all having a little conversation over here, and we're making sure that we all know what everybody's going to do and what the plan is, to make sure that we get that person safe. There are obviously situations, there's no shortage of video that's available, unfortunately, where excessive force has been used by individuals who shouldn't have been in that situation and probably shouldn't have been in that role as a police officer. Mm-hmm. But in order to address those, my personal belief is that we need to empower the police to make sure that they're able to remove those people from those roles without any fear of reprisal. Because just like I know in any profession, there's always a spectrum of quality. And I'm sure that in your career as a politician, as well as a broadcaster, you could probably go, oh, that guy's great. And that guy's a train wreck. And that same thing exists in every profession. So just like I can say, well, there's paramedics that I would absolutely, without hesitation, be comfortable treating my family. There's some that aren't. There's police officers who I'm sure could say the same thing about their coworkers. But what we need to do, particularly for police as a city, is empower those officers to be able to address the problems that are driving that kind of behavior.
You know, it's interesting you see that, because I think that whole approach applies across the public service in the city of Calgary. I bet every single job department has just your high performers and those who are mailing it in. And that I think creates some of the frustration on the part of taxpayers, but it also creates frustration on the part of those in the public service. Have you ever seen any model that we could use where you actually can counsel people out of a profession they are no longer well qualified for? Because I think that you've really touched on something important there across the whole range.
I have. I would argue that to some degree, a lot of first responders utilize that model. There's different. I mean, in EMS, for example, and I really wasn't planning on spending this much time talking about the whole EMS world, but in EMS, for example, there's different types of paramedics. So I'm what I would call a street paramedic. There are paramedics who purely do interfacility transfers, and they're still bringing an incredibly high level of skill, but it's overall, on the average, a lower stress load. There's paramedics like community paramedics who go out into the community. I think that EMS has created a model where there's lots of different opportunities for people to go, depending on where they're.
Well, then let's broaden this up then, because if you've seen that model, how would you apply that to trying to improve the productivity and reduce the spending in the city of Calgary?
I think there's lots of different ways. The first thing that we have to do is be able to have the conversations, though. And that's where I'm gonna bring it back to the politics side. We have to be able to have people who are in positions of leadership who are willing to show through their own behavior what actual leadership looks like. So the fallacy that we always have to present ourselves as always being in absolute control and never ever admitting our mistakes is a flawed model of leadership, because it sets an unattainable standard, because most people only see what's going on when it's in front of them. And I think with any level of government, I'm sure you could probably speak to this. I think with any level of government, regardless of whether we're talking about MLA or leader of the opposition or whatever the case may be, there's always that public face and then there's that private face. And I think that if we want to rebuild trust with the electorate, we have to be willing to be a little bit more honest, including emotionally honest, with the people that we're trying to represent, because there's no shortage of examples, even in the current city council, where people have not allowed themselves that opportunity, and it has created crisis.
All right. Well, let's see if we can get through a bunch of other civic issues and get your perspective on this, because I don't want to run out of time with you, and there's lots to get to still. So we were talking about how you deal with the issue of affordable housing. You dealt with the homelessness aspect. But what about this big battle that we're having, the guidebook to great communities? It seems like the tension there is, do you have a development approach that is centered around densification and building up, or one where you're building out and doing greenfield construction? How would you approach that balance?
Well, first of all, I would say that when I was talking about too much theatrics in politics, that's a great example. To me, there's no question that the infrastructure deficit that we see, particularly in areas like Ward 3, are a direct result of aggressively building out. We have built communities that are islands unto themselves, but that don't seem to be able to access greater city infrastructure. Is that me that's causing that horrible noise?
It was warbling a little bit, but continue on.
Okay, sorry. But we have these islands of communities that aren't in any way interconnected, and I think that's what causes a lot of the infrastructure deficit. So again, it comes back to balance. Do we need to increase densification in some areas? For sure, we do. Do we need to take some more pragmatic approaches to making sure that when we're building new communities, they have the appropriate infrastructure ready to go? Because one of the things that it seems to me, at least, and I could be wrong, but one of the things that it seems to me, at least, is that we have, for the last long time, we've been building communities trying to chase after a tax base. And so we never quite catch up. So, we got to build another community. And then we never quite catch up. We got to build another community. And it's this endless cycle that's not working. And it only creates farther and farther and farther infrastructure deficits. So, I mean, do we need to have a diversity of communities? Absolutely. Are there areas where we can pursue greater densification? Absolutely. Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I don't think that having a conversation about some increasing in density in communities where homes and buildings are ending their life cycle is a negative thing. Honestly, I look at the whole guidebook thing and it's a tempest in a teapot for me. And it's a wonderful distraction that came immediately before a municipal election by accident, I'm sure. But the reality is that there's nothing binding to it. It's a plan. It's a framework.
But you do see that those who live in R1 zoning, single family homes, are worried that they're going to end up with a skyrise built across the street.
Sure.
That's what they're worried about.
If I want to add a deck onto the back of my house, I have to do consultation with my neighbors. That's part of the permit process. So if people in communities are legitimately concerned about whether or not somebody's going to drop a skyscraper in the middle of Hidden Valley, which isn't going to happen, but hypothetically, if people are concerned about that, I would encourage them to avail themselves of the existing consultation framework that exists, because there's no shortage of projects that have been stopped by communities that are dedicated to doing it. Those pathways exist. People have a lot of power. And if they're that concerned, I mean, one of the other areas that I struggle with this whole conversation is when we're talking about the communities that are like most affected by this, we're talking largely about communities that are centered around the core. So these are communities that have been around for a very long time. They are already experiencing gentrification. I mean, you take a drive around any of the communities that are within a 3-kilometer radius of the core, and you're going to see infills left, right, and center. So I love heritage homes. One of my happiest moments for me as a Calgarian, when they moved there was a house that was on 18th Avenue in the Southwest, just off of 17th Avenue, the big brick one. And it was slated for demolition, and they moved it a block and a half, and it sits on 17th Avenue now. That makes my heart so happy, because that's protecting our heritage, which I think is really, really important. But that's not necessarily what we're talking about with the guidebook.
Well, truly. Let me ask you, since we've been talking about capital infrastructure and projects, when you make certain decisions, it means that there's not enough money available for others. And so I want to talk to you about some of the big ticket items that were approved. Against the recommendation of the CFO, they said that they didn't have the money for all 4 projects, but council approved them anyway. Talking about the event center built with the Calgary Flames, the BMO Center expansion for convention space, the Arts Commons transformation, and the Foothills Fieldhouse. So if you'd been on council and were told you can only choose one of these, what one would you have chosen?
That's a tough question. I think for me, in order to give a real answer, I mean, my immediate answer is that I would want to take a look at what facilities need replacing the quickest. I know that there's an appeal for the field house, and I know that Calgary is one of the few cities that doesn't have a field house, but I don't know that it's critical. The Saddle Dome is past its lifespan. There's no question about that. And while I would have liked to see a different financial arrangement with the different partners that are involved, is how I'll phrase that, I think that what that facility is going to bring in regards to not just the sporting world, but the entertainment world as well, brings a lot to the table. So if I had to pick one of the all of the options, it would probably be that one, because I think it's the one that would be most accessible to Calgarians. But again, I want to be really clear. I was not super thrilled with the way that the financial details were hammered out, and I would have pushed for a different arrangement on that.
All right, let's talk a bit more about how we get the economy going again, because I think that this is the big question. If we can get people moving here, get businesses moving here, in some ways that assists us in solving some of our revenue problems. What do you think the solution is?
I don't think there's just one. I think there's a lot. And I think that it would be disingenuous to say that Calgary doesn't having a whole lot going against it right now. This is why I was referring earlier to the fact that we're going through a major paradigm shift on a lot of different levels. But I do fundamentally believe that Calgary is up for meeting that challenge. One of the things that I go back to again and again is the spirit of this city is unbelievable. I was one of just by luck, I was one of the first responders on the ground in the 2013 floods. The unit that I was with was doing a training thing, and they announced, oh, by the way, we're not doing this scenario, we're doing the real thing. You have an hour. Wow. What I saw come out of Calgarians in those first couple of days and in the aftermath of that event, that's where I go when I people say, is Calgary going to be able to do this? Of course we're going to be able to do this. The question is how. And to me, there's a lot of different factors that have to come into play. One of the things we have to do is make sure that different markets around the world know that Calgary is an amazing place to live and work. It's a vibrant city that offers a lot. That also means we have to offer a lot. So when we're talking about things like that, there's a communication strategy that has to exist, and those don't come for free. So we have to be willing to invest some money in that, and I think the city is doing some of that. We also have to be able to provide the infrastructure and the things that people are looking for, like parks, like the quality of life things that a lot of companies look for. You take a look at what Infosys talked about when they were listing off the things that made them come to Calgary, and very little of it, what they described, was economic. The vast majority of what they were talking about was education, opportunity, the beauty of the city, the recreational options. I mean, we've got a lot going for us, but we have to do a much better job, I think, of celebrating it and letting people know. I mean, one of the frustrations that I have is there's this mentality that I'm starting to see of like, and that's not who we are. That's not who we are. We have so much to offer, and I love that I get to call this city home. And the people that I know who have lived here for any length of time feel the same way. We just have to get the opportunity going again. And so again, that goes back to making sure that we're attracting business, but it also involves us recognizing that we have to economically evolve a little bit. The reality that nobody wants to say, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but I will, because that's what I'm trying to do, is we're never going to see the infrastructure jobs that we saw 15 years ago come back to oil and gas. It's not going to happen. I've had conversations with vice presidents of some of the largest oil companies who have confirmed that. So what are we going to do next? There's no shortage of opportunities. I believe that Calgary can absolutely still be an energy hub and a leader in energy, but that means that we got to recognize we got to move forward on some things, and we got to let go of some things. And that's always a challenge, but it's a challenge that Calgarians are absolutely up for.
All right. Let me ask you just a last couple of questions here on how you see your role as an elected council member, because we're going to see a couple of referenda in the fall as well, one at the provincial level, but also fluoride is being put to the people. And then they could have put the issue of speed limits to a public referenda, but they chose not to. They chose to make the decision on that. So give me your sense. These two issues come before you. What would you defer to? Would you say, hey, I know how to make this decision myself? Or would you say, I trust the people?
I don't think it's an issue of trusting people. I think that misrepresents what a referendum is. Ultimately, and I've said this already, I believe that an elected official's role is to fundamentally listen. It includes listening to their constituents, and it includes listening to the experts. And if an elected official is able to demonstrate that that's what they do, I think that earns them the trust of their constituents. So I look at, with very few exceptions, I look at referendums as a failure to build trust with constituents. Fundamentally, that's what it is. Because if you're going to elect people to make decisions, then they have to make decisions. And I think that it's a great way of driving people to the polls, because you can pick some really emotional issues and get people fired up, so you know they're going to show up to vote. But I'm not sure that it's the best way to do democracy. So what I've said in regards to the fluoride referendum, personally, I'm for fluoride. I will be voting for fluoride to be added in the referendum. That being said, the existing council has made the decision that they are going to put it to a referendum to the people of Calgary. And I think that it's incumbent on whoever the next council is to respect that decision, because to do so would only further damage the trust that exists between government and the electorate. So I've publicly said that while my personal stance is I'm entirely for fluoridation, whatever the result of the referendum is will dictate how I vote on that issue.
Okay, perfect. Last question then, in a similar vein, because you're going to be in a position where the administration is going to tell you, here's a decision for the city of Calgary, it's good for Calgary as a whole, but your own constituents will say, I don't want to go there. They'll ask you to take the opposite position. How would you end up mediating between those two options?
It's a fascinating scenario, because you'd have to have some incredibly accurate polling data in order to construct that scenario. But that being said, I think that if you have established that trust with the people that you're representing, and if you have been presented with compelling data that shows this is the best path forward, I think it's incumbent on the elected official to explain the reasoning to the electorate in a way that is accessible to them. The example that I'll use is, I get called for people who are in pain all the time. The only way that I can address that pain is to start an IV. I've yet to meet anyone who's like, oh yes, an IV today, I'm excited about that. Nobody wants an IV. But there's that little bit of pain that you have to have in order to get the pain relief. And I think that if there is overwhelming data and evidence that suggests that there's a best path forward, that's where you have to be willing to be honest with your constituents and say, this part's going to suck, but it gets better.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the conversation today. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You got it. That is your Ward 3 candidate for City Council, Nate Pike.